Okay, good morning and welcome to the latest in our 10-minute takeaways. Today I'm talking to Laughlan Steer, who's a senior associate with Silver Shemmings Ash, on his particular area of keen interest, which is renewables. Good morning, Laughlan.
Morning, Julie.
Now, you've done several articles and several seminars on this topic, one as recently as last month, and again a part 2 to that next month. So we just thought we'd catch up on a few of the headline topics from those that came out of that seminar, if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
So firstly, what is the problem with traditional fuels?
Well, I think to answer that, we should probably first just recap what these traditional fuels are. And we're talking about coal, natural gas and crude oil, and nuclear is sort of in there as well. Of course, nuclear, not a fossil fuel. Nuclear energy itself is renewable, but of course the material in power plants isn't. So there is that distinction to be made. But what is the inherent problem with certainly the fossil fuels? Well, that would be carbon emissions. And of course, as anyone who's read any of my articles or come to any of the talks will know, carbon emissions and our targets in relation to those, such as those under the Paris Agreement, it's something that I'm, very, very passionate about and something that we've discussed at length. And I think it's the threat to the environment by way of carbon emissions that is one of the biggest issues with fossil fuel power generation.
Okay, so how is the UK doing against its renewable energy targets?
Well, again, another good question. Clearly, we have some time left to meet them. But of course, in terms of the Paris Agreement, where we agreed to get global warming to 2 degrees, and unfortunately it looks as though in the next 100 years we could hit 3 degrees, so that's not great news at all. Now, cheating a little bit and lumping in nuclear energy into renewables targets, power generation just generally, there's a bit of an issue here because of the 8 plants that we currently have, which make up about 20–25% of the electricity produced in the country currently. By 2030, we're due to lose all but one of them. So there is obviously going to be a huge shortfall there in energy. And how this is going to be plugged and how we bridge that gap is another matter. Now, a lot of people will say, well, natural gas, that's something of a low carbon alternative to coal. But of course, what that doesn't take into account is all of the carbon emissions that happen during the extraction process, transportation process. And, as I said in my talk, it's these fugitive emissions that often get conveniently ignored when touting natural gas as a lower carbon alternative to coal, say. But we do need to look at how we're going to bridge this gap for the power shortage, which is impending, frankly.
Okay, so what barriers are there to a wider uptake of renewable energy?
Well, it's a bit like what Salman Rushdie said in Haroon and the Sea of Stories. You're never up in time to see the milkman, but you don't mind drinking the milk. And I think that perfectly encapsulates the sort of NIMBYism that we have. If you were to ask someone out in the street and say, would you be happy if suddenly lights were off at 6 p.m., no fridge, no TV, etc., etc., they'd say, well, that's ridiculous. And yet these would be the very self-same people protesting, picketing, writing to their MPs saying, we don't want these wind farms anywhere, either onshore or with inside offshore, and we certainly don't want the construction of, say, renewable energy power stations, say an anaerobic digestion plant. They would say it's noisy, they would have concerns about the emissions from the flues, and they would have issues about, of course, all of the logistics of the feedstock coming in as well. And yet these are the people who would want to make sure that they have sufficient power to enjoy their houses. So there is always that tension there of, well, yes, I want everything, but I'm not prepared to concede that there may be the need for some infrastructure in my vicinity. Of course, particularly if you live near to an industrial estate, that may not come as much of a surprise, but I can understand equally why people want quiet enjoyment of their property.
Okay, yeah, that's fairly self-explanatory.
Mm.
In your seminar recently, you referenced the circular economy. Could you just expand on that a little?
Yeah, by all means. This is a very interesting topic because the current position, or what's more common, I should say, is a linear system where we produce, we use, and then we discard. And of course, that explains the issues we have with landfill and the many millions of tons which have been dumped there, but also can be used. So this brings me on to what the circular economy is. So that is a closed loop process whereby items are produced, they're used, and then they're reused. So to take an example, and one that I briefly discussed in the talk before, if a small anaerobic digestion plant were to operate in, say, a town, small town, they could take on the waste food from farmers, slurry as well, that sort of thing, and effectively combust that. And then any materials left over could then be used as fertilizer. So you can see then that the wastage element is minimal, and things that would otherwise just be cast away can then be reused. Now, of course, that relates to organic matter, and also you can combust items like plastics. And of course, millions of tons of our landfill has been burnt this way or combusted for our power. So we are making moves in the right direction, but of course all of that is contingent upon support from the local authorities and indeed support from the residents and of course the funding for these plants too.
Okay, you also mentioned RDFs. What are RDFs?
Yeah, well, we touched on that briefly just now. RDFs are literally refuse-derived fuels. And as I mentioned, the Germans pioneered this actually by burning tyres back in the 20s. So yeah, we have them to thank for that. And it's the idea that actually, with the right technology, you can pretty much burn anything, subject to various exceptions, of course. And so RDFs are refuse-derived fuels, and that picks up a wide array of items across what would be considered to be waste, which can be used then as fuel. The funny thing about this now, of course, is that we're in this rather perverse state where black bin bag waste is more renewable than wood, just due to the amount of it that we have here. And so it's interesting, I think, that's the position that we've come to.
Indeed. I've also heard about beer waste being used to produce energy. How does this work?
Yeah, these were some guys, my understanding is it's the north of Ireland, and they came across a way of using waste barley that's obviously been discarded or used in the brewing process. And there was a two-stage chemical process whereby if you did a heat wash and then a chemical wash, obviously it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the rudiments of it. You could then create from that activated carbon and carbon nanotubes. So what we have here is an example of, can you imagine this, where literally your beer could be the fuel to your barbecue. So I think it's quite a nice idea, from brewery to the barbecue. And so it's an incredible process. Given the circumstances we find ourselves in, I wonder how much more waste barley there's going to be used for this sort of thing. So I think fully support any innovation in this field, and well done to those guys.
Okay. Are there any other developments in the news or coming up, or that you're aware of currently?
Well, there are, and it feeds in quite nicely to the next talk. So it was actually in the news very recently that there's a British family who've produced the first self-sufficient hydrogen-powered home in Devon. So I'll be going to talk a little bit about that in my next talk, as well as hydrogen fuel cells generally as well, and heating too, technologies that have evolved there.
Excellent. Okay, well, we look forward to Renewables Part 2, which is on the 24th of June, I believe.
It is,
and
yes.
Places are available for booking now, and I think you're also bringing out an article between now and then, aren't you?
There will be an article indeed, yes, so all that to look forward to.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Laughlan. That's been really interesting, and we look forward to speaking to you soon.
Speak soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.